Shalom, and welcome to On the House, the podcast where you'll find everything you need to know about purchasing real estate in Israel. Hosted by Debbie Goldfisher, real estate consultant and founder and CEO of BuyItInIsrael.com. In each episode, Debbie sits down with leading industry experts to explore market trends, legal and tax issues, smart buying strategies, neighborhoods across Israel, and more. All this is On the House, helping you make the right move.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the second episode of the 8th season of On the House, a season dedicated to renting property in Israel. Last week, we had the pleasure of speaking with Rivka Leibowitz, certified financial planner and founder of Living Financially Smarter in Israel, a 40,000-member Facebook community. Rivka shared valuable insights on the financial considerations of renting versus buying in Israel, helping our listeners understand not only the costs and opportunities, but also the emotional and lifestyle factors that play a role in this important decision. Today, we're honored to welcome Advocate Avi Unterman, a seasoned real estate lawyer who has handled hundreds, if not thousands, of contracts for English-speaking and Israeli clients renting and buying homes across the country. At Buy It in Israel, we rely heavily on legal expertise, and Avi has been a trusted partner and friend of our platform. Beyond his professional services, he shares our passion for educating and empowering buyers, landlords, and tenants to make the process of finding a home in Israel as smooth and straightforward as possible. Avi, welcome to the show, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Debbie. Pleasure to be here.
Avi, we get countless questions through the Buy It in Israel website from both sides of the rental equation. Landlords wondering how to protect themselves and structure a fair contract, and tenants looking to understand their rights, obligations, and what to watch for before signing. So today, I'd like us to cover as much as possible from both the landlord and the tenant's perspective so that our listeners walk away feeling informed and confident. Before we start, I'm very curious. Roughly what percentage of your real estate clients would you say come to you for rental-related issues versus buying?
I would say about 10 to 20% are rentals and the other 80% plus are buying.
Purchasing. And of those 10 to 20%, I'm assuming a number of them return later to buy.
Yes, that's correct, of course.
They start off renting to figure out where they want to be.
Generally, good advice. If you're not sure where exactly you want to be, it's easier to move if you've rented rather than if you've bought and have to sell.
Sure. Okay, so let's get into the basics of the rental agreement or the lease. Actually, I'm curious to know, what do you call it, a lease? Or?
A lease is simple. It's fine.
Okay. So when dealing with a rental in Israel, is it always necessary to have a formal lease?
Yes, the law does require there to be a written agreement that incorporates many of the basic terms that we'll go through and talk about, but definitely you should have a written contract with the landlord. Absolutely.
And who usually provides this contract? Is it the landlord, the agent, the tenant?
Usually the landlord or the landlord's lawyer will be the one to put together the contract.
Mm-hmm. So a tenant can't say, I have a contract, let's use this.
If the landlord agrees to it, then fine, but they often have their own.
Mm-hmm. So there's no standard rental contract in Israel?
There's not. Some municipalities have their own. I think Iryat Tel Aviv, the Tel Aviv municipality, did issue a standard format of a contract that people could use if they wanted to, but there is no absolute standard published.
Mm-hmm. And does it have to be in Hebrew?
No, it can be in English, no problem, as long as it's understood and agreed on and signed by both sides. Then we do English contracts when both sides are English speaking, absolutely.
Any language?
Yes, in theory, yeah. As long as, the parties understand it, then it should be. It's ideal to be in their mother tongue if possible. But it can be any language.
So actually on that note, a lot of people say they get the lease in Hebrew and they just run it through ChatGPT. What do you think about that?
That's fine if it's reliable. Google Translate can be a bit tricky, but more straightforward. I often recommend, at the very least, have an Israeli speaker go through it with you. I'll often do a summary or review it with the clients, whatever they need, and provide them with an English summary or go through it by Zoom or something like that. It's important to understand what's in there and to flag any questions and to discuss them with your attorney.
Just to go back about AI, I mean, I don't think somebody should rely on it
No,
entirely?
I wouldn't rely on it entirely. I'd make sure to have it reviewed by a human who knows what they're looking at. Google Translate may be a bit, clearer because it'll translate the entire document. And if there are clauses that don't seem clear in the English, then
ChatGPT actually does a great job at translating entire documents, but you do have to run through it.
yes,
Things
you have
can
to
be
careful.
left out. Do you recommend always involving a lawyer?
Definitely having a lawyer review and consult with and advise you, at the very least, to have them walk through and check the lease. And as we'll see, the law is pretty comprehensive, but it's important to look for flags, and sometimes you do need a lawyer to negotiate as well. It's not recommended to try and do it yourself unless you're very, very confident and knowledgeable. The lawyer can really add an important amount of protection to any tenant, especially
Sure.
with a good, in-depth review of what's
Sure.
going on.
Okay. So what I thought we should do, Avi, is I want to go through like the key terms and clauses of a contract. Before we do that, there are two things that are often mentioned in an Israeli lease that I want to address and just explain to our listeners. One is key money, dmei mafteach, and the other one is what we call the tenant's protection law. Can you just give us a brief explanation of those two issues?
Yeah, the briefest explanation is they are not relevant to any leases that anybody is coming to do nowadays.
So why are they included in the lease?
They're in there because to make it clear that the tenant who is coming in is not paying any key money. It is not entitled to a protected tenancy, like you may be familiar with rent control in New York, where people are entitled to stay on potentially for their entire lives and their rent. And it does exist in Israel for leases done, for tenants prior to 1968, etc. So you always have to put in the lease that this is not a lease of key money, dmei mafteach, or rent control, direct mugenet, and those laws and those protections do not apply, which means there's a start date and an end date, and when the lease is up, if there's no agreement to extend and there's no basis for the tenant to stay on, then the tenant has to leave. So those are standard clauses, and they do confuse many tenants, but it's just an important clarification to protect the landlord, to make it clear that this is not a protected tenancy. This is a regular lease agreement.
Understood. Let's talk about the duration of a typical lease. Okay, what would you say is the standard period of time for a lease in Israel?
So most leases are for 1 year, possibly 2 years. Obviously, there are some shorter-term leases, and there are longer-term leases. The most important thing for clients to know about is an option or an extension, called in Hebrew a breira, or an opsia, which is an option in Hebrew. And that's something that a savvy client, a savvy tenant who is negotiating, about the terms, where the landlord may want 2 years, may want the tenant to commit to 2 years, and the tenant who's not sure may not want to commit for 2 years. They may say, okay, well, give me 1 year and give me an option to extend for the second year, which gives the tenant the right, if it's drafted correctly, to, under the terms of the option, usually it states the tenant has to notify the landlord, let's say 60 days before the end, if the tenant wishes to extend for another year. So it's binding, it has to be binding on the landlord. The tenant has to give notice, the tenant cannot be in breach, and usually the rent terms would be already built in, so the rent for the first year would be a certain amount, and it would already say during the option period the rent will go up to whatever the increased amount is. These are commercial terms to be negotiated. Obviously, a landlord would prefer a commitment for 2 years. The tenant may not want to commit for 2 years, but may be willing to negotiate or may be able to negotiate an option in there to extend.
Mm-hmm. So the tenant basically has the option to extend, but the landlord does not have the option to get out, to terminate the lease.
Correct, if it's drafted correctly. Sometimes they put in there subject to the landlord's consent, in which case I explain to the tenant
it's worth nothing.
This isn't worth nothing. The landlord can say yes, the landlord can say no. You have to read it. It has to be drafted carefully and properly. If that's what's negotiated on and agreed on, you have to make sure that it's in there and done right.
So from a landlord's perspective, why would he do this?
Well, the landlord may want the tenant to stay and may want to incentivize this tenant to stay and be happy if the tenant stays for the second year at the rent that's agreed upon, and understand it's pre-locked in. And theoretically, if the tenant does want to stay, they're going to stay at that increased rent, and there's an incentive for them to do so. if they're happy, and obviously if they're not in breach, etc. And if the tenant isn't willing to commit to a full 2 years, at the very least, there's the possibility in there. But you're right, it does handicap the landlord to a certain degree. And if the landlord doesn't want the tenant to stay for the second year, if the option is in the contract and there's no termination right, then the tenant has the option to stay for the second year. So it's a negotiation tactic.
Sure.
It could be 2 years plus 2. It could be 2 plus 1. There are all sorts of different structures that can be negotiated if you know what you're doing and how to present them.
I know for many olim, they take a 1-year lease, and before they know it, the year has run away, and they want to use that option, so take advantage of it. So it's a good mechanism to have. I'd also say right now we are recording this in the summer months, which are definitely the heaviest turnover periods for rentals. And actually at the moment, the rental market is very, very, very strong because so many people, unfortunately, have been displaced from their homes, both from October 7th and, believe it or not, people that have still not returned to their homes in many places. And after the Iranian war, 12 days of ballistic missiles did so much damage. Many residents have been displaced. So the rental market is very, very pressured. And I would say the landlords, for now, have the upper hand.
Absolutely, that's true for the most part. It does depend on the area. For example, in Tel Aviv, properties without a mamad are less desirable.
Right.
People want to move to a place that's safe, or if you're on the top floor and there's no lift, and the mamad is the basement, martef or something like that. That's also a big downside. So there are factors that influence the rental market. Obviously, scarcity and supply and demand. People wanting to move to what's considered safer areas that have less, suffer less attacks, things like that. That definitely impacts it.
Absolutely. And as I was saying, the summer months are the most popular for rentals to commence and terminate. Basically, it works around the school year. People want to move when they don't want to disrupt the children. The weather's good. People don't want to move during the rainy season. And generally, most rentals turn over, I'd say, between like June to beginning of September time. Would you agree with that?
That's correct. And that also impacts the rents. A property that turns over in the middle of the year, if you're a tenant and you can find such a property, you may be able to get it for cheaper than it would go for the summer months, because there are lesser demand for it. But at the same time, you're limited in your options if you are looking to rent or take your place sometime during the middle of the year. So that does impact it. And the summer months are very busy also, getting movers available, towards the end of each month, the beginning of each month.
You pay more. You
definitely pay more for moving, and there's other associated costs, absolutely. But it is generally recommended for tenants and for landlords to have it roll over in the summer to make it easier for the tenants to find something else and for the landlord to find a new tenant. For both sides, it's recommended to do that.
Sure. So something that I think about a lot, Avi, is let's say a lease ends on July 31st and the new lease begins on August 1st. Like, we're going to talk a little bit later about the handover and the transition period, but is that enough time?
It should be, meaning the existing tenant has a contractual obligation to move out and may have obligations in the lease to potentially to paint, which is often included in rentals here, especially if it was freshly painted for the tenant when they moved in, prior to them moving in, whether by the previous tenant or by the landlord, and give the keys back on July 31st in the property in, the same condition, minus normal wear and tear. Those are the standard kind of terms. And the new tenant who wants to come in, first thing August 1st. And, should not be any issue for the old tenant to move out and just give the keys directly to the new tenant to move in, provided that they've done the tenant moving out has fulfilled the terms of their lease. That's what they're required to do.
We're going to come to that soon, but I sometimes feel like maybe it would be good to have a little buffer, for the landlord to make sure that everything is, as we say, כמו שצריך.
Right. Ideally.
For the new tenant.
So, if the landlord is concerned about that, they could try and have a walkthrough maybe a few days prior to the end of July to see how it is, if the tenant's already moved out, to see what damage there is, or potentially if it's in good condition. It's not really common for the landlord to deliberately start the lease a week or two later, especially because the rollovers are the end of 1 month, beginning of the next month. But a landlord can certainly do that and can offer it to the new tenant on August 7th if they want a week, gap, if they feel that they might need it. Alternatively, when the new tenant comes in, if the previous tenant hasn't done the place, the landlord can say to the new tenant, look, I'm sorry, the previous tenant left a huge mess and damage. I know it's just unpleasant for you. While you're, moving in, I'm going to bring my guys in to fix it up and paint it for you and do what needs to be done because the previous tenant didn't do it. They can always discuss, should we reduce the rent or something? And, the new tenant will understand, that it's not necessarily the landlord's responsibility, but there is a way, to figure it out if necessary. He or she's doing it for the tenant, so they have to work together.
Absolutely. So let's talk about early termination. Is it common for a lease in Israel to include a clause, either the landlord or the tenant, to terminate early with advance notice?
Yeah. So before we talk about that, I think it's important for us to talk about the law, because this is where...
That's why you're here.
That's why I'm here. That's what I do. And this is where so many landlords go wrong, and even lawyers for landlords get this wrong. Because if you're not familiar with the law is very comprehensive and includes a large number of protections for the tenants that the landlords are not allowed to put in the contract otherwise, except for the tenant's benefit. You cannot contract out of these clauses in the law, and they're quite significant and they're quite comprehensive. Okay, and I see this all the time. For very expensive, lease agreements, and I explain to the landlord when I review them, this is not legal.
Give us an example.
Just this morning, I was reviewing a lease for, an expensive property in Tel Aviv that's rented out for 18,000 shekels a month. And the law limits the guarantee, which I'm sure we'll talk about, the cash guarantee. The law clearly limits it to 3 months' rent. There's a couple of other factors, but that's the maximum. And the lease that was originally signed took 4 months' rent. And I explained to the landlord, this is falling foul of the law. This is not in compliance with the law, and you're not allowed to put in the contract otherwise and impose that on the tenant. That's just an example. So let's talk about the early termination. This is very important, and I'll give you other examples how people can trip up on this in quite a major fashion. The law says very clearly, a termination right, that's not because the tenant's in breach of contract. Obviously, if the tenant's broken the contract and is not paying the rent or causing damage or whatever they're doing, after a certain notice period, etc., you're entitled to say that's it, it's over. But we're not talking about this situation. We're talking about any other situation. You cannot have a termination right for the landlord that is not also granted to the tenant. Okay, so that's point number one. So if it says the landlord can terminate the lease at any time by giving 90 days notice, full stop. That's not valid. It's not binding. It doesn't apply.
How about the other way?
You're allowed to have, if it's for both sides, you can have either party may terminate this lease by giving advance notice.
But if the tenant wants it, then the landlord also is entitled to it?
No, I mean, that's usually the case. If the tenant asks for it, then the landlord may put it in for both sides. But the requirement is on the other way around. If the landlord has it, the tenant has to have it.
Okay.
And another point on that, the law says that landlord has to give at least 90 days notice, and the tenant has to give at least 60 days notice for this early termination. But don't forget, you're not allowed to change that clause except in the tenant's favor. So you cannot play with those dates, except the landlord can give more notice and the tenant could give less notice. But you cannot change it the other way around. You cannot require the tenant to give more than 60 days notice, because that's not allowed. And you cannot allow the landlord to give less than 90 days notice.
The law is very much in favor of the tenant.
And it's not valid. The clause is not valid. And I'll give you an example. I've seen situations where my clients are buying a property and there's a tenant in there, and the agreement is that the seller will deliver the property without the tenant, will pay the final payment, whatever date is agreed upon, free and clear, the tenant won't be there. And when I look at the lease agreement, the lease says the landlord can terminate at any time by giving 90 days notice. And the lawyer and the landlord think that they can just notify the tenant the tenant has to leave, and they can then deliver the property to us.
Well, they have 90 days notice.
They have 90 days notice. But if it's not a hadadi, if it's not a termination right that's also granted to the tenant, then it's not valid. And which leaves, potentially my client, the buyer, in a sticky situation, but really the landlord will be in breach of contract, committing to give us the property on April 1st, free and clear of any person, including the tenant, when I know that they cannot enforce that termination right.
So even though it's in the contract, you can't enforce it because
it's not valid.
It's
the
not
law
valid
says it's not a valid clause
tenants.
because it has to be for both sides. And this is something basic. And you're talking about potentially material breach of a sale contract that could incur hundreds of thousands or even more of shekels of damages because people don't know the law and they don't know that it's not enforceable. Now,
so for anyone who's looking to buy something where there's a tenant, it's very important to make sure that this clause is valid.
Right. And if you're on the selling side and you say, if the buyer says, well, I don't want the tenant there, and you say, okay, no problem, I can have a clause, I can kick them out, you have to check that. Hopefully your lawyer will review the lease as well and make sure. And look, the tenant may leave.
Right.
But if the tenant says no, and you want to try and enforce that clause, you have to be very careful to make sure that it's drafted correctly so it is in fact valid and binding.
And from the tenant's perspective, if somebody is telling you that the property is on the market and we may sell it, then you want to make sure that you have that 90-day clause.
Not necessarily. So first of all, it's a good question. And this comes up a lot as well. What happens if your landlord sells the property? If the lease is a simple 1-year, 2-year lease, no termination clauses, no rights for anybody, the lease applies, it continues to apply, the buyer has to take over the lease, right? They're allowed to, the landlord's allowed to sell the property, it says so in the law, and it's all subject to the lease, so the lease continues with the buyer. And the seller has to notify you who is the buyer, here is the way of communication with them. There's some potential friction in the transfer, especially if you're a buyer, but your rights are not affected. If there's no termination right in the lease. If you're a tenant, let's answer another question. Sometimes a tenant says to me, should we put in a termination right? And I explain to the tenant, usually it's not recommended. Okay, meaning if there's no right, if it's a 1-year lease, if you're willing to commit to living in the place for 1 year, you're going to be moving all your stuff in, you're going to be setting it up, you're going to be putting your kids in school, etc. If you ask for a termination right, it's likely to be for both sides. And you're under risk of the landlord at any point saying, okay, I'm giving you my 90 days notice. You don't want that to happen. If you're willing to commit to the full year or whatever the period of the lease is, then, don't ask for the termination right. Just take the full year and don't have the landlord put it in. And sometimes if it's in there, I tell the tenant when we're negotiating, we should take that out, right? Is it going to be more beneficial for you? Is it more risky? And it could be risky. If the lease says he can give you 90 days notice and you can give him or her 60 days notice, the day after you move in, something may happen. He may change his mind. He may sell the place. He may decide he wants to use it for his family. Here you go, 90 days notice. I just moved all my stuff in and set it up and bought the furniture and So why do you want that? So I always recommend we take it out unless there's a very specific reason why the tenants may not want to take the property for the whole year.
Makes sense.
And can we go on? I want to talk about a potential alternative to that clause.
Please.
And this is what we call in Hebrew socher chilufi, okay? A replacement tenant.
Okay.
Okay? And this is something that's very important to be aware of. Okay? The right to bring in a reasonable replacement tenant also exists under the law.
Even if not in the contract.
Even if not in the contract. But I always recommend it's always much easier to have it in the contract because it's actually in the law, not in the chapter on residential properties, just in general lease agreements. But the recommendation is to have it in the contract. And the language goes along the lines of, usually there's a clause that the tenant isn't allowed to sublet or assign, and the tenant's committing to pay the rental for the entire term. And I would add in, notwithstanding that, the tenant is entitled to bring in a replacement tenant to take over the tenant's obligations and undertakings throughout the remainder of the term, who is reasonably acceptable to the landlord. And the landlord cannot reject the replacement tenant except for good cause. That has to be, explained or delineated, given clarification about. And that, at the very least, instead of the tenant having a potential termination right, if things don't work out, they're not happy with the location, or the job situation doesn't work out, and they need to move, at the very least, they can advertise and try and bring in somebody else to take over, which may be a good middle path instead of having a termination right that the landlord could also trigger, that leaves them potentially exposed, that the landlord would trigger it through some point through the term. So I do recommend considering that instead of a termination right, if that can be negotiated into the contract.
I see. So what happens if the replacement tenants then leave? Does it go back to the initial tenant?
Well, usually not. Usually there would be some kind of a three-way agreement or separate agreements where the replacement tenant would sign with the landlord saying, I'm taking over this lease, or maybe they may sign a new lease, whatever the parties agree on. At the very least, they would sign saying, I'm taking over the lease from the middle through the end, and I commit to making those payments.
And the first
and the
guy
landlord
is out.
should, the initial tenant should obviously get, the release that says, you've paid up, as long as you've paid up your rent, etc., till the date where the new tenant comes over, you're out, and your term is complete because you've brought in the replacement tenant as the lease requires. So, you don't want to be in a situation. You're not subleasing it; you're assigning it. Somebody else is taking over from that point on till the end.
So what makes a replacement tenant reasonable under the law?
That's a very good question. I mean, this reasonable will come up in a few areas, which we'll discuss. It's quite a grey area. You could think about situations where there are cases where the landlord would not want a replacement tenant if they don't have the ability to give the guarantees that we haven't talked about yet, the various guarantees. If they cannot give the replacement guarantees, that would be a reasonable cause to say, look, they cannot supply with a deposit or guarantors or things like that. You could argue if there's a kind of, they don't have jobs, so he or she could be legitimately concerned as to how are they going to pay the rent.
What if they have a lot of children and the landlord feels that they're going to trash the place, but they're willing to pay and they're willing to put down the deposit?
So that's a very good question, and it's probably a great area. I'm not familiar with specific cases where that question has been discussed, and it could really be a very open question. I mean, obviously, it depends potentially on the property and the neighborhood. If it's a neighborhood where lots of families have lots of kids, then it may be more legitimate. If it's a neighborhood of, empty nesters and retirees, and it's not kind of so common and not done and not so legitimate, then maybe the landlord has a legitimate cause, or potentially the landlord could request from the replacement tenant a certain higher level of responsibility for repairs because they have a large family and there's potential for more damage.
Got it.
Something like that.
Okay. Let's talk about the rent itself. So how often is rent typically paid in Israel, and how is it paid?
Right. So most leases have the rent paid usually every month in advance, on the first of the month or whatever date the lease starts. There are leases where landlords request the rent be paid every 2 months in advance, potentially 3 months. I've seen 6 months. I've seen the entire year. Usually that's very not standard, but
Comes at a discount.
Sometimes there may be an advantage in the tenant if they're willing to do it for cash. They have the cash and the landlord's willing to do it. That's obviously a bigger protection for the landlord, and there should be a discount. Never mind the net present value of the money, but also the risk on the landlord where the rent is fully paid in advance.
Sure. Okay, so and how is the rent usually paid in Israel?
So there's a number of different ways. The most common ones are, or the more old-fashioned method, is by giving post-dated checks, which a lot of landlords in Israel still like to do and request. And when I deal with the tenants, especially the Olim, and I'm like, do you have a checkbook? I'm like, no, I never ordered one.
I don't even have any cash, let alone checks.
Right. So so you have to go order a checkbook. If the landlord's not willing to budge, go order a checkbook from the bank and do it quickly, because you're going to need a whole bunch of checks, 11 post-dated checks to give for the rest of the rent, or 23 if it's for 2 years, and the landlord's going to need them.
The first one is paid at signing.
Usually the first rent, so you could do that as a wire or something, but the landlords want the post-dated checks. The alternative is a horat keva. It's a standing order, direct debit, where you could set up on your bank account, where you give an instruction to the bank, pay the rent on the first of each month to the landlord, and you give the instruction in advance. Now, we'll explain, there is potentially a legal benefit to having post-dated checks instead of a horat keva, a standing order. A standing order can be cancelled at any time. Mm-hmm. Those checks, I'm sure you know, can also be cancelled. But if somebody cancels a check is a legally binding promise to pay, right? So if you give me a check, you're promising to pay me that money, as long as I've given you whatever it is we've agreed upon. I've given you the use of my property, you're promising to pay me that rent. I go to my bank and I say, Debbie has promised to pay me this amount of money. Here's a check. Please take it from Debbie's account as per the check. The bank tells me, sorry, it's been cancelled, or the account's closed, or there's no money, or she put a stop, or whatever the situation is. I can then take that check that's bounced, and I can go to Hotzah L'Fa'al, and I can open a file against you, and I can say,
translate that?
Hotzah L'Fa'al is the bailiff's office or the sheriff's office. It's the enforcement authority. It's very important. And I can say, I have here a promise to pay, which is what a check is, that's been, it's not been approved by the bank. I mean, it's been cancelled. I legitimately have a reason why I'm entitled to this payment, because I rented her my property, and I want to open a file against Debbie, and I want to put a lien on her assets, her bank account, garnish her wages, to enforce and recoup the money she owes me because she promised to pay me with this check, and she didn't actually pay me because she stopped the check.
Okay, so that explains why they want checks in their hand.
Correct. And we'll talk about, when we talk about the other guarantees, there is something else that's an alternative to that, but that's one of the reasons why it's so common. And the other reason is just that this is the way things have been done for so long, and especially old-timers, as we like to call them, like to do things the way they've always been done, tradition, and they follow the way that they've been doing things. I do want to say one other thing that's important to know about renting in Israel. In certain parts of the world, in the UK, in the US, you have in many neighborhoods professional companies who own multiple properties and rent them out. They're a professional management company. They know what they're doing. They manage multiple properties. They have, standard forms, and it could be bad, they could be good, but this is what they do. It's very, very common in many neighborhoods. In Israel, it's very rare. And
it's actually becoming more common.
Yes.
And I have almost closed with somebody who's going to join us on the show in a few weeks' time. So try my hardest to get him. So we'll talk about that. But you're right. For the most part, it's not so common.
And what that means is when you're a tenant, you're dealing with somebody who either maybe inherited a property and continues to rent it out, or bought it as an investment, or bought it and then moved. It could be just an individual who's not a professional property owner, it's not a professional landlord, management company. They're doing it themselves. They've got some lease that they got from a lawyer 20 years ago that they, when I see them, and that they only have in PDF, they don't have it in Word. It's completely all back to front, and I've seen everything. And you're dealing with non-professionals. You're dealing with a regular person who can leave completely the breadth of potential, qualities of the landlord can go from very good, wonderful, mensch, everything's fine, fix whatever you need fixing, we'll be flexible, don't worry, we'll look after you, to I don't care, I'm not spending a penny, I'm going to, make your life a misery, I'm going to ignore you when you need something to be fixed because it's my, somebody else, my parents' apartment who died, I'm a busy person, I don't want to deal with it, I'm just renting it out for my siblings, they don't, and that leaves tenants. It explains why it's even more important to review the lease carefully, to understand your rights under the law and under the contract, and try and negotiate for the most favorable terms to know what's going into that. So that's why you get these old-fashioned landlords demanding rent checks, post-dated checks when nobody uses them anymore.
I see. But going back to that, if you have it in the contract that I owe you every month, 10,000 shekels, if I agree to do a standing order, then isn't that enforceable?
That's a good question. The question is how to enforce it, okay? And we could talk about that in the context of the guarantees, if you like. But the simple standing order can be cancelled at any time by going onto the bank account and or telling the bank cancel the standing order. And then the question remains: what other tools does a landlord have? Has a landlord demanded in order to enforce a tenant that's not paying?
You're saying that a cancelled check is more easily enforceable.
It's one of the methods of enforcement, but there are plenty of others, which is why when I represent a landlord, I ask my landlords, do you really want checks that you have to deposit? You can deposit them in advance with the bank, by the way.
Right.
You probably pay a fee, but you
check
pay a
out
fee.
for-
You pay a fee for the bank when you walk in there, and you try and make an appointment, or you sneeze or something, they'll charge you.
Welcome to Israel.
Yeah, so you can deposit them in advance, but then I guess if there's a problem and you need to get them back, otherwise you have to deposit them every month. You can do it on your app, or you can go into the bank. I normally say, why you're making the tenant write out all these checks and sign them, and then you're making yourself have to go and deposit them. A standing
what do you
order.
what do
A
you
standing
recommend?
order is easier, and instead of using that potentially cancelled check as a method of enforcement, we'll use some of the other methods that are equally as enforceable.
I see, which we'll come to.
Yeah.
Okay. Should rent increases be built into the original agreement? So let's say after the option, we take a lease for 1 year, we exercise the option for the second year. What happens after that?
The large majority of leases, there's nothing after that. It's a free market. There's no legal restriction that people are aware of, except there is a clause in the law that says that the landlord has to notify the tenant a reasonable time in advance of the terms to continue renting. This is something many landlords and lawyers are not aware of, that the landlord has an active responsibility under the law to inform the tenant a reasonable period of time in advance, which is definitely something like 2 months, maybe more, to say, if you want to stay, I'd be happy to have you as a tenant, and the rent's going to go up, whatever it's going to go up, right? So that's one thing that the law requires.
And they can put it up by any amount that they want?
There's no restriction under the law as to how much they can put it up. I have seen and negotiated, it's very, very rare to do so, where the lease will say, should the parties wish to continue renting the property, or should the landlord wish to continue renting it out, maybe if the landlord doesn't need to use it for themselves or hasn't sold it or something, then the rent shall, the parties can negotiate the rent, but it shall not increase by more than X. But that's very rare, and the landlord usually would not agree to that, to limit it, because they don't know what the market's going to be like in this free market, and if the market's gone up, they're free to negotiate with the tenant, and the tenant's free to leave if they're not happy with the rent, because neither party is bound.
From your experience, what sort of percentage does rent increase?
So it's a good question. There is something like 3 to 5% on average, which is close to inflation. It does depend on where the market is, supply and demand.
Also, if there's a new tenant, or if it's a renewal.
Yes, that's right. A renewal might be, it's a little cheekier to extend an existing tenant with a massive increase of 10, 15%, but that does not mean it doesn't happen. As we said, if there's no automatic ability to continue renting that's built into the lease, like the option that we discussed, then the landlord can tell the tenant, as long as they tell them in a reasonable time in advance, look, the rent's going to go up 10, 15% next year. Do you want to stay? If not, I'm going to rent it to someone else. And that's a commercial negotiation that the tenant can say yes or no to. There is no legal restriction on the landlord. If the tenant feels that it's not justified and the market doesn't support it, they can try and negotiate or wait it out. But ultimately, once the lease is up, they certainly have no right to be there, and they have to move out unless they agree something with the landlord.
So if they agree to continue, is it important to have another contract?
Absolutely, 100%. You have
What do you do?
You have to, just a very simple, it could be a one paragraph, which anybody can draw up. I do draw it up for my clients that says the parties signed a lease on this date, and the term has run out, and the parties agree to extend, or is running out on this date, and the parties agree to extend for 1 year or 2 years, whatever's agreed upon, and the rent is now X thousand a month. All other terms are the same. And that's it. You sign, and then you have it memorialized.
So just send a WhatsApp. We're happy to continue the lease. We're willing to pay 10,000 shekels. The landlord agrees. Is that sufficient?
Well, yes. Good question. That's probably considered a binding agreement, right? If push came to shove, and there was some kind of a question mark over whether or not it was agreed to extend for the full year at this rent, a WhatsApp with a thumbs up or an okay or agreed should be enough, and there is case law on this that's considered enough. It's a meeting of the minds. Contract law requires both parties to show that they've agreed. But it's still good form just to have a one-page amendment. The Iriya may require some kind of written documentation to continue putting the Arnon in the tenant's name. You may need it for other purposes, and that WhatsApp,
good order.
Well, that WhatsApp may not be good enough for the requirements you need to prove you're getting some kind of subsidy, you're getting this, that, or the other. You need to be able to show you're living there. just, put together, you can even do it yourselves, a one-line agreement, we agree to extend the term for another year, the rent is X, signed, on this date, both of you sign. That's
and it's an extension of the lease dated.
Yes, and all other terms, they would remain the same anyway if they haven't been explicitly changed. And we normally lawyers add all other terms remain the same, if they're not changed.
You don't need a lawyer for this necessarily.
You don't necessarily, no, it's very simple, but.
Right. So I would say it's good practice if you're a tenant or a landlord, a couple of months before the end of the lease, have a conversation, discuss what's going to be happening at the end of the lease, and if everyone agrees to continue, put it in writing. And if you agree not to continue, do you need something in writing?
No, you don't need something in writing. It's automatically over. Just to emphasize your point, it's not just good practice. There's a legal responsibility on the landlord to, if he wants to continue, to tell the tenant a reasonable time in advance what the terms would be. So there is a responsibility on the landlord to do that, not just good practice. But if the lease is over, there's no agreement otherwise, there's no understanding, there's no contract, the tenant has to move out on the final date.
Got it. Okay. So we're going to do something now that we have never done before, and we're going to take a break. There is so much information and a lot to digest here, so I think it makes sense to end the episode here. And please God, we will continue next week to broadcast the rest of the recording. Stay tuned, and we'll see you next week. Bezrat Hashem.
Thank you for listening to On the House. A special thanks to Mordechai Gordon, our editor, who makes it all possible. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with family and friends. For more insights, expert guidance, and access to listings and projects across Israel, visit buyitisrael.com. That's BUIT in Israel.com. Have a question or a topic you'd like Debbie to cover? You'll find contact details in the show notes. Whether you're planning Aliyah, searching for a home or a haven, or looking to support the Israeli economy, now is the time to buy it in Israel.